Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Alexander Evans, a counselor in the British Diplomatic Service and a senior fellow at Yale's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. Mr. Evans recently was the Henry A. Kissinger Chair in Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Library of Congress, and previously worked at the Department of State as a senior advisor, first to Ambassador Richard Holbrooke and then to Ambassador Mark Grossman, the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He previously served as a British diplomat in Islamabad and New Delhi, and as a member of the policy planning staff in London. Today we talk with him in a personal capacity about the U.S. and South Asia. Welcome, Mr. Evans.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've done a lot of writing and research on the U.S. and Pakistan. Tell us a little bit about your findings.
Well, it's a really complicated relationship, and a relationship in which both sides feel often betrayed by the other side. And one of the interesting things about delving into the archives, particularly of US foreign policy on Pakistan, is to see this theme again and again, right back from the late 1950s onwards. And equally, if you go back to Pakistani speeches and press statements and Pakistani sources, you see the same kind of story about disappointment with the United States and disappointment with the relationship. The reality is actually the relationship's been much more cooperative than people sometimes think, and both sides have tried to use it to advance their own national interests. So there's a rationality that underpins both the US approach to Pakistan and Pakistan's approach to the US. The trouble is the issues that Pakistan wants out of a relationship at different times and the subjects that the US has wanted from Pakistan have changed depending on what the main themes are for those countries at any given moment.
Okay. And what is the traditional relationship between South Asia expertise and policy making in Washington?
Well, I think that the myth of the relationship between expertise and policy making is that expertise has very little input into policy making in DC. I'm not sure that that's true. I think the experts regret sometimes not being able to be at the top table when key decisions are made. And it is true that when key foreign policy decisions are made on India or Pakistan, but they're not going to be made by a mid-level analyst or the in-house expert on the subject. But at the same time, I think if you look at the archives, the degree to which principals, so the senior members of cabinet in the US making decisions about foreign policy, actually draw on advice and analysis that is deeply steeped in knowledge about Pakistan or India or Afghanistan, actually expertise has a very key role to play. I think the reality, though, is that policy decisions are made by political principals, not by experts, and that sometimes is something that makes experts unhappy.
Do you think that in making policy more should be given to the expertise, the people who know about, what is going on, perhaps?
No, I think it's right in any democratic society. It's right that elected politicians and members of the cabinet make the key decisions on national security for that country. There is a danger about experts, which is experts can think that they are right more than they actually are right. So they can be overconfident about judgments that they make or the analysis that they offer.
I see.
So actually a little too much expertise can be a dangerous thing in policy making.
Interesting. Is there an example you might be able to cite, perhaps? Anything spring to mind?
Well, none of the experts, it seems, that worked on Pakistan in the 1970s necessarily anticipated the kind of relationship that the US would have with Pakistan in the 1980s. So experts don't have any more ability to predict the future than any of us do, than you or I do. So the danger is when experts think that they can predict the future. The reality is that none of us can predict the future.
Right. And given the current problems in South Asia, including Afghanistan, how do you think the U.S. should be approaching Pakistan?
I think the US needs to approach Pakistan with serious intent, and that means even when there are frustrations, recognizing that there's a relationship there that needs to be managed with Pakistan. It's far better to raise problems in private than engage in the sort of megaphone diplomacy of complaint. And that's a problem that sometimes has been evident both in Islamabad and Washington. The key over the next couple of years is that the US still needs Pakistan. It needs Pakistan in terms of the US counterterrorism interests inside Pakistan. It needs Pakistan in terms of managing any political process in Afghanistan that will be really the underpinning of stability, or indeed the lack of stability, in South Asia in the coming 5 or 10 years. That doesn't mean that you give Pakistan everything that it wants or that you sugarcoat the relationship, but it does mean that you have to do business and have a working relationship. One of the suggestions that's been made has been that Pakistan should be contained or isolated. And this is, a natural argument given the frustrations with Pakistan in Washington. But I think, some of the harder-edged arguments about containing Pakistan neglect to understand the nature that A, the US needs Pakistan, and B, Pakistan has other friends, China, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Turkey, and actually isolating Pakistan on the international scene would be quite difficult to do.
Yes, it does strike me as we're in a very tricky situation, so to speak, because we do need Pakistan. How do you think the United States should be working with Pakistan, and what is it exactly do you think that Pakistan wants from us?
Well, in terms of what Pakistan wants, and when we say Pakistan, we're not necessarily talking here about all of Pakistan's people, but there's a sense of wanting to have the dignity and sovereignty of Pakistan respected. For Pakistan's military, who have been very much the architects of Pakistan's national security culture and interests, they're very keen to balance, or at the very least offset, India's growing power in the world. So it's a very India-centric foreign policy that Pakistan pursues. And this is something that the US has been aware of right back to the late 1950s. And that's a factor that we have to understand properly of the Pakistanis and what they want. In terms of how we actually work with them, I think there has to be a recognition of where US and Pakistan's interests combine. And one of those commonalities is in a peaceful, stable Afghanistan. And sometimes where they may differ. But Pakistan may want the US to be much more active, for example, on solving the problems between India and Pakistan. And that's not something that Washington necessarily wants to get drawn into. So it's a case of taking a balanced approach that is conscious of the US national interest and focused on achieving that, but is also conscious of the style of engagement with Pakistan and the importance of personal relationships with senior Pakistanis, and the fact that Pakistanis, in particular the Pakistan military and politicians, want to be respected in international affairs and don't want to be humiliated or perceived to be humiliated in their relationship with Washington.
How would you characterize our relationships with certain individuals in Pakistan today?
I think it's no secret that the relationship has been troubled in the last year, and it's been troubled because Pakistanis have complaints about Washington's policies, both in Afghanistan and on terrorism, and Washington has complaints about Pakistan's apparent willingness or commitment to support US goals in the region as well. So it's been a troubled relationship, and a relationship that has also been subject to many shocks. So some of the problems in the relationship don't come from things that either side can predict, but they come from incidents or crises that emerge with little notice and can really derail some of the ordinary business of trying to build a relationship together.
Can the United States influence what happens in South Asia in the coming years?
I think this comes to the heart of the question of diplomacy. How much influence can any one country bring to bear on another? And in fact, the question of influence is something I teach in an undergraduate course here on diplomacy. The US clearly does have some influence in South Asia. One case at the moment is the crisis that's going on as we speak in the Maldives, where some form of change in government has taken place. The former president argues that it's a coup. The new president argues that it was a constitutional change. And the US has been very active. Bob Blake, the Assistant Secretary of State, has flown out to talk to both sides. And the US has clearly played a positive role in bringing democracy to the Maldives. Not something that gets international headlines in the New York Times, but a very important move for the people of the Maldives. It's more difficult to see India or Pakistan or Afghanistan choosing to do things that are not perceived to be in their national interest because the US wants them to do that. And so India, I think, will tread very carefully in terms of being drawn into an alliance with the United States vis-à-vis China. Pakistan will be very careful not to be perceived to do Washington's bidding in Afghanistan, but to pursue its own interests, which are much more linked, as I said earlier, to India. So the limits of influence, I think, really come up to national interest, and it's where those national interests sometimes are competing rather than points of cooperation with Washington.
Okay. You mentioned teaching a course on diplomacy. How are you bringing what you have experienced in the outside world in terms of diplomacy and policy making into the classroom?
Well, I'm really enjoying teaching two courses here at Yale. One is a graduate course on South Asia, and the other is an undergraduate course on impact and influence in diplomacy. I think with the South Asia course, the approach I've taken is to try and use declassified documents wherever I can in the teaching of the course. So if we're going to discuss the India-Pakistan war in 1965, the trick is actually saying here's the CIA analysis, here are the cables that came in from India and Pakistan from the US embassies, here's the National Security Council document debating what should be done by the US about the crisis.
Wow, that sounds like great fun for the students.
Well, I hope so, and I think it offers a window into how policy actually takes place, and how it relates back to impressions that countries have of each other, and how expertise plays in the system, in a way that perhaps just using secondary sources doesn't give you the immediacy or the connection to it. In terms of teaching on diplomacy, we all know that we're living in a changing world, a world where new powers like China and India and Brazil are becoming more important on the international scene. And I think trying to build a course around comparative diplomacy, so looking at actually how do these countries operate in terms of their diplomatic reporting network, how do they make national security policy, what's their approach, not just to the US, but their approach to the wider world around them. And I think that's an interesting exercise in building a global appreciation of how states operate and how some multilateral organizations operate as well. So the course is as much focused on how Singapore or Turkey operate in the international system as the traditional approaches to diplomacy, which tend to be more focused on Britain or Germany or the United States.
So, for instance, Singapore has a very different approach to diplomacy than, for instance, Britain?
Well, Singapore has a different set of national interests, and it has a different size of diplomatic service. The Singapore diplomatic service is much smaller than the British Foreign Office.
Sure.
And the Singapore Foreign Service is an interesting case in point because they don't actually have an enormous number of embassies worldwide. But what they do with a very small number of diplomats is try and build on relationships with third countries. So in terms of their relationship with Washington or with Japan or with the European Union, they'll try and use that to really understand as much as they can about what's going on in the world, and then actually lobby and influence on Singapore's key national interests. So I think some of that is really interesting. The way in which they invest in talent and quality foreign service officers is very striking, and the fact that many of those foreign service officers don't always stay for a career. Many will go off and leave and work for a management consultancy or an international bank. And the Singaporeans are comfortable with that. Their argument is how do they compete for the best possible talent to pursue diplomatic excellence in their foreign policy.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you very much for having me.
For more information about Mr. Evans, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.